In this video we're going to learn how we can monitor authentication logs in our Linux systems using Vector and BetterStack. Now modern Linux systems will output authentication logs to a file, and this file gives you a single source of truth about all access attempts to your server, as well as any superuser commands or authentication failures. Now proper monitoring of these logs is key to understanding any patterns and identifying any breaches that might occur on the Linux system, and this proper monitoring can enhance your overall security. We're going to show the auth.log file in this video, and we're going to use Vector to collect these logs and transform them to JSON, and then ship them onto BetterStack where we can centralize and then analyze these logs. And we're also going to show how we can create charts and dashboards using BetterStack. So let's get started. Give the video a thumbs up if you're enjoying this content, and subscribe to the channel for more. Now let's start by looking at some of the Ubuntu documentation on Linux log files. So let's go to this introduction section, and this is linked below the page. One of the things that makes Linux a great operating system is that virtually anything and everything that happens on and to the system may be logged in some manner. And that information is invaluable for using the system in an informed manner. And these logs should be one of the first resources that you use to troubleshoot your system and application issues. Now the Ubuntu system provides vital information using various system log files, and these are typically text files that are stored in the /var/log directory on Ubuntu distributions. And many of the files in that directory are generated by the syslog daemon. Now we saw examples of that in a previous video on the rsyslog service, and that should be appearing on the screen now. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at another system log file that is generated and stored in the /var/log directory, and that's the auth.log file. This one here, /var/log/auth.log. Now the authorization log, it tracks the usage of authorization systems, and it tracks the mechanisms for authorizing users which prompt for user passwords, such as the pluggable authentication module, and that's otherwise known as PAM, and we're going to see examples of the PAM logs later in the video. Now the authorization log is also going to track any sudo commands and remote logins using the SSH daemon. Now let's bring up a terminal, and this is Ubuntu running on Windows subsystem for Linux, and if we look at the current directory, you can see we're in the /var/log directory. So if we list out the contents of this directory, we get some of these log files that are generated by the system, and we can see the auth.log file here among others, such as the cron.log file. And we also have the syslog files themselves being stored in this directory. Now the focus of this video is going to be the auth.log file. We want to take the contents of that file, we want to use Vector to collect those and transform them, and then we want to ship the transformed contents to BetterStack for centralization and for analysis and alerting. We'll see that later in the video, but let's start with a look at the auth.log file. So let's just run the tail command here and look at the last 50 records of auth.log. And what we can see here is that sessions are being opened and closed for users on the Linux system. And you can see these messages generated by the pluggable authentication module. And what's going to happen anytime we run a sudo command, as you can see here, this is going to be logged out in the auth.log file. So any super users who are running commands, any commands that they execute are going to be logged in this file so that you can analyze them if anything has gone wrong on the system. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch users on this Linux distribution. So I have a user called BetterStack, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in with that user using their password. Now when we log in, you can verify that you are the user with the 𝗖𝗵𝗽 command, and now you can see that I've been switched to the BetterStack user, and this user is part of that sudo group. So what we're going to do is we're going to cd back to var/log, and in this directory, if we list out the contents, we again see the auth.log file. And we can look at the contents of that with the tail command again, and let's grab the last 50 lines of that file, and we're getting the permission denied. We need to run this with the superuser privileges, and then we get back this output. Now at the bottom, there's something interesting to note here. You can see the sudo command that's been executed by the BetterStack user, and we get some useful information about the command, such as the directory where this command was executed, and also the command itself, and that was the tail command, and we looked at the last 50 lines of auth.log. Now if we scroll up a little bit here, you can see the session being opened for the user BetterStack, and that happened when we switched from my normal user to the BetterStack user. And when that happens, we get a new session being opened for the user BetterStack, and also the session being closed for the original user. So all of this information is captured in the auth.log file. Any activity on our Linux system that's produced by the auth facility is going to be captured and redirected to this file here, the auth.log file. And let's see one last example. I'm going to try and switch back to my normal user, and I'm going to enter an incorrect password here. And when we do that, we get back the authentication failure message on the terminal. Let's again look at the last 50 lines of the log file, and that has been captured here. We have an authentication failure, and we get some extra details about that failure in this log file. Now, this kind of logging allows you to detect whenever someone is trying to execute super user commands, or whenever someone is trying to assume the role of a user and they're getting that authentication failure. Now again, for more information on how this works, check out the video on 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀, and you can see the rules that are set up to capture those authentication logs and redirect them to this file. Now what I'm going to do is remove the 𝗿𝘁𝗲 user from the sudoers group. So let's go back to our original user, and we're going to execute a command now, and that's the delete user command, del user. And the user that we're going to remove is the 𝗿𝘁𝗲 user, but we're not actually going to remove the user. What we're going to do is remove them from the group, and that group is the sudo group. And when we execute that, we've removed the user 𝗿𝘁𝗲 from the group sudo. And one other thing that's captured in the auth.log file, if we assume the role of 𝗿𝘁𝗲 again, so let's switch to that user now. If we now try and execute a sudo command, for example, check the status of the rsyslog service, when we execute that, we get this message that 𝗿𝘁𝗲 is not in the sudoers file and that incident will be reported. So let's switch back again to my normal user. And again, let's go to the /var/log directory, and we're going to execute the tail command on the auth.log file. Now if we look at the bottom of this file, that log about the user that's trying to execute the sudo command, but they don't have the permission for that, they're not in that group, that is captured here and it's output in the log. So again, this is something that we can detect using the auth.log file on Ubuntu. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to use the vector log shipper to collect these logs from the auth.log file, and we're going to implement a vector transform to convert this syslog output to JSON. And then we're going to ship them to a remote source where they can be centralized and analyzed using 𝗿𝘁𝗲. So vector is going to allow us to automate this process, and we did a video on vector recently, and that should be appearing on the screen now. Check that out to learn more about exactly how vector works, and also to learn a bit about the vector remap language that we're going to use in this video. Now just as a quick refresher, what we're going to do is look at the vector documentation here, and this image here encapsulates exactly what vector does. It takes data from various sources, and in our case that source is going to be the auth.log file on Ubuntu. We can then optionally transform that data in some way. Perhaps we can add new fields to the data or delete existing fields, or we can convert data from one type to another. And then finally, we send the transformed data onto any number of sinks. So for this example, the source is going to be the auth.log file. The transforms are going to convert these logs from syslog format to JSON. And then finally, that converted JSON data is going to be sent to 𝗿𝘁𝗲 for centralization, and later we'll create dashboards around that auth data. Now outputting to JSON rather than this plain text format that we see here has some powerful benefits. By using JSON, we can easily extract relevant information from log outputs, whereas on the other hand, this is just a text file. It's unstructured, even though it is in that syslog format. And we have vector already installed on this Ubuntu distribution, and we can check that with the version subcommand. If you need to install vector, check out the previous video we did on that topic. Now for this section of the video, we're going to refer to this guide on the 𝗿𝘁𝗲 website, and that's a guide on monitoring Linux authentication logs. You can find even more information about this topic, about the auth.log file, and how we can ship that to 𝗿𝘁𝗲 using this guide. Now there's a section on the sidebar here on structuring Linux authentication logs. So let's click to that, and we can see this paragraph here that log parsing is essential in order to transform varied log messages into a uniform and easily analyzable format. Now what we're going to do is use vector in order to do that, and vector has a configuration file called the vector.yaml file, and that's located in the /etc/vector directory. Now as we mentioned a second ago, vector comes with three main components. We have sources, we have transforms, and finally, if we scroll down here, we have sinks. And you can configure all of these in the vector.yaml file. So let's start with the source. And in this example here, we have a source called auth.logs, and that source is of type file, and we are pointing that at the auth.log file. So let's copy this block here, and we're going to go back to the terminal, and I'm going to cd into the /etc/vector directory. And if we list out the contents, we get that vector.yaml file. So let's edit that now, and we can use nano in order to do that. So we're executing sudo nano vector.yaml, and in this file I've cleared out the default configuration, And you can see we have empty blocks here for the sources, for the transforms, and for the sinks. So let's start by pasting in that configuration for the source. So we're pasting that in there, and that's pointing at the system's auth.log file. We can now move on to the transforms. So I'm going to go back to the browser for that, and we're going to copy this transform here. Now we can see that this is quite a large transform, and we have some conditional logic in the body of this. So I'm going to copy all of that, and we can then go back to the terminal, and I'm going to paste that in here, and then we're going to go back to the documentation again, and we're going to look over what this is doing. So we're defining a transform called parse auth.log, and the input to that transform is the auth.log's source that we've configured just above here, and that matches the name of this block in the YAML configuration. So the input from the log file is going to flow into this transform, and then we define a type for the transform of remap, and that means we're going to use the vector remap language for the source below. Now again, if you're not familiar with the vector remap language, you can check out the previous video on this topic. There is a section in that video where we explain this dot operator and also how to access fields or properties on the log event. Now we're going to walk through some of the lines of code here. If you're not interested in that, feel free to skip to the next section of the video. So let's get started. At the top, we are calling one of the vector parsing functions, and that's the parse Linux authorization function. And we pass the log message into that, and what's returned from this parsing call is going to be assigned to the log event using that dot operator. Now we can look at the vector parsing functions here, and we have parsing functions for a variety of different file types. For example, for Apache log files here, if we look at the left-hand sidebar, we have the list of all of these, and the one that we're using is this one, parse Linux authorization. So let's click that, and this function will parse the authorization logs that are found usually in the auth.log file for Debian systems, and the equivalent for Red Hat systems is the secure file. And it takes a single parameter, which is the value that you want to parse, and that value should come from one of those files, and it should be a formatted syslog message. And we can see an example of this here. When we call that function with the given string passed in, it's going to parse the contents of that string and return this JSON content here, and this object contains keys and values for each of the fields in the authorization event. So that's the first line of code that we have in this remap here, and below that we create a field called event, which is equal to an object containing a single key called category, and that category is authentication. Now below that we have a number of conditional statements, and in each one of these we are checking if the message contains a string of some type, and the strings that are passed in here are equivalent to some of the events that occur and are stored in the auth.log file. So for example, if we have the text failed password in the message property, we're going to set the name field on this event object above to failed password, and the context is going to be set to another expression here where we call one of the parsing functions. This time it's the parse regex function, and the expression passed in here is going to check for a variety of conditions using a regular expression. And we're not going to go over all of these, you can find this in the documentation, but this code should be enough to parse different types of events that are stored in the auth.log file. So we have a number of if-else statements, and the only thing each of these is doing is setting the name property on the event and then setting a context property to what's returned from the parse regex function. So that's the transform, and the last thing we need to do at the moment is add the sink to the vector.yaml file. So let's copy the sink, and we're going to go back to the configuration file that we have, and then if we go down here we have a section for the sinks, and I'm going to paste that content in there. So we define one with the name of print, and the type for this at the moment is going to be console. And what this means is that it's going to take the logs from this input and it's just going to print them out to the terminal. So let's now save the vector.yaml file, and what we can do is we can test this out using a command. So I'm going to run a command called vector validate here, and we're going to see that the output for that is going to validate whether or not the vector.yaml file is valid. And we can see all of these ticks here. Everything is looking good. So now that we've validated that, let's clear the terminal and we're going to test this out. We can test it out with the sudo vector command, and that's going to run the vector process based on the configuration in that YAML file. So let's run this now, and we get the output from our transformed auth.log file appearing on the terminal. And you can see that this output is now formatted. It's an object with various keys and values, and you can see some of the nested keys here, such as context, that were added in that transformation. So now that we have a process that's doing that collecting and the transforming of the auth logs, what we can now do is we can actually centralize this output by sending it to BetterStack. So all we need to do now is add one extra step, And if we go back to the vector.yaml file, that extra step is just going to be to add a new sink that's going to send these logs over the network. And we're going to use a source on the BetterStack platform to actually send those logs to, where we can then collect them. And we're going to build some dashboards based on those logs later in the video. Now what I'm going to do is go to the BetterStack platform now, and I'm on this page for sources. Now a source represents a service that you want to collect logs from. And what you can do is you can create a source by clicking on the Connect Source button here, and you can create one here, and if you're following along with this video, you can set the platform to vector. Now I'm going to go back to the sources page here, and I already have one, and it's called Linux Auth Demo. So let's click this now, and we're going to see the live tail of this source, and we can see some of the log events that were generated earlier as I was preparing this video. Now what we're going to do is add a new sink to vector, and that's going to collect the logs and transform them, and that's going to ship those transformed logs to BetterStack, where we can analyze them using this source. Now let's go back to the BetterStack guide, and on the left hand side we have a section on centralizing our authentication logs. And if you want to know more about creating a source, you can follow the guide on this page. What I'm going to do is scroll down, and I'm going to copy this line of code here, and this again is for the vector.yaml file. And what this does is it sets up a new sink, and that sink has the type of HTTP. So in Vector, if you create an HTTP sink, it's going to allow you to ship the logs over the network to a source, and you define where it's going to go using this URI property. Now we can also configure the method for the request. In this case, it's going to be an HTTP post request to the given endpoint. Now one thing we need to do in order to get this working is we need to define an auth block at the bottom here, where we have a strategy of bearer, and we need to add a token into this block for the source that we've created on the BetterStack platform. So to start with, what I'm going to do is copy this sink here, and we're going to go back to the vector.yaml file. So let's get out of this, and we're going to run sudo nano, and again it's the vector.yaml file, and we're going to go to the bottom of this file where we defined the sink. And I'm going to actually remove this sink that we have for printing to the console. So let's remove that now. And I'm going to paste in the BetterStack HTTP sink to replace that. Now one thing we need to change here is the token. So we need to actually get a token from the source that we have on the BetterStack platform. So let's go back to BetterStack now. And on the sidebar we have the sources page here. What we can do if we look at the Linux Auth Demo source is we can click this and go to configure. And that's going to take us to a configuration page here where we get some information, and it's the source token that we have here. We need to get that and copy it and then paste it into the vector.yaml file. Now when you first create a source, you're automatically going to be given the token here, but if you already have one that you want to use, all you need to do is go to the sources and you can click the configure button here to be taken to that page. So let's go back to vector.yaml, and I'm going to paste that token in here. And then we can save the file and go back to the terminal, and we can test this out again using the vector validate command. So let's run that, and it all is looking fine with that. So now let's run the sudo vector command, and when we execute that, we're getting back some output here, but hopefully the logs that have been generated and transformed from the auth.log file are now going to be shipped over the network to our BetterStack source. Now let's test that out by going back to BetterStack and looking at the live tail for this particular source. And you can see our new logs that are being generated here, and if we look at these we can see some of the keys and values that have been extracted from that auth.log file using the vector transformation. Now this particular command is tracking a sudo command that was executed on the terminal, and that command was this one here where we used nano to look at the vector.yaml file and edit that file. So when we changed the YAML configuration for vector a minute ago, we used sudo to do that, and that sudo command has been tracked and stored in the auth.log file. We used vector to collect those logs and transform them to JSON. And finally we configured a sink to send those logs to BetterStack, and that's where you can see them here. So we have an event in our application that's tracking these sudo commands and sending them to BetterStack along with other contents from the auth.log file. Now I'm going to generate a failed authentication attempt, and we're going to go back to this page after we do that. So now that we've done that, let's go back to this page and scroll down to the new events. And I want to look at this one here where we have an authentication failure. So we're going to look at the properties when we have an authentication failure here, and we're going to use some of these to create a visualization using the BetterStack dashboard page. So we can see the context here. We have an error that has a value of authentication failure, and if we scroll down we have the event here, and the category was authentication, and this is the important one for the visualization that we're going to create. It's the name of the event, and it's equal to sudo authentication failure. What we want to do is we want to create a chart using 𝗿𝘀 that's going to allow us to track any time this pseudo authentication failure happens on our Linux system. And we want to get an indication of how often these failures are happening and get that information charted out using a dashboard and a bar chart within that dashboard. So how do we do that? Now what I'm going to do to start with is go back to the sources page, and again we're going to go to the configure section for this Linux auth demo source. And that takes us back to this page here where we got the source token earlier in the video. What we're going to do now is go to this tab on logs to metrics. Now we can ignore this message. We get this whenever we add or remove a metric from the source. I've just removed one that I'm planning to re-add right now, so that's why we're seeing this message. What we can do is scroll down and we're going to create what's called a group by. And we can create a group by column using this page here. Now let's click the button at the bottom, and that's going to take us to this form that you can see here. Now we can give our group by a column name, and I'm going to call this column event name, and the reason for that is because we're going to extract the name of the event and we're going to check if that's equal to a pseudo authentication failure in order to chart out how many times that incident has occurred. So after we give the column a name, we need to define an SQL expression here, and you can see the placeholder that we have in this field. We can use the JSON extract function to extract some data from the log event, and the first parameter to this expression will be the data itself, and then we can look at particular keys in that data, for example an event key, and we can add as many arguments to this function as we want if we need to get some nested data. So for example, in the event we have a field called HTTP response sent, and that in turn has another field called duration in milliseconds, so we can extract that information using this, and the final argument to the JSON extract function is essentially the data type of the returned value. So we're going to define our own expression, and what we want to fetch, if we go back to this log event, is we want to fetch the event's name, and we want to be able to group by that particular property in order to get the number of occurrences of this particular name of pseudo authentication failure. So in order to do that, we need to get the name property from the event. So let's go back to this page, and we're going to use the JSON extract function, and we can pass the JSON in there. And the first key on that data is the event key, and the nested key is the name of the event. Now we expect the name of the event to be a string, so I'm going to pass a data type here of nullable string, and that's going to be our SQL expression. If we scroll down, we have the ability to set a codec, and we're going to keep the defaults for this now, and we're going to create this group by using the button at the bottom. Now that group by has been successfully created, and we can wait for our metrics to be rebuilt, and typically that's going to take 3 to 4 minutes. And if we scroll down to the group by section, you can see the event name group by that we've just created, and we have a badge here of creating. So while this is in progress, that's going to be there, but very soon you're going to be able to use this new group by in your SQL expressions on the dashboard. So while that's creating, we're going to go to the dashboards section here on the left hand sidebar, and at the top left we can create a dashboard. And for this example, we're just going to select a blank dashboard, but we have different options here if you're interested in looking through those. Once we've selected something, we can add the dashboard using that button at the top right. Now I'm going to give this dashboard a name, so let's call it dashboard number 1, and we can save that, and that's going to be the name of our dashboard. And then we can create a chart, and these charts allow you to get real-time insights into how your data is evolving over time. So I'm going to click this create chart button, and we get taken to this page here. Now what we need to do to start with in this case is select a source, and we're going to select the source of our Linux auth demo, and that was the logs collected by Vector on Ubuntu and shipped to 𝗿𝘀. Now we have different ways of creating a dashboard. We have a drag and drop interface, and there's also the ability to select an SQL expression, and that allows you to write some SQL, and that gives you good customization over the output. And there's also a log filtering block here. Now for this example, what we're going to do is just use the drag and drop interface, and we can add fields to the x-axis and the y-axis in order to build these charts. Now what we want to do here is we want to add a chart that's going to allow us to track all examples of this log event, and that was the pseudo authentication failure. And we might want to do this so that we can understand, well, someone is trying to execute sudo commands, but these authentication attempts have been failing, and we want to track how many times that's happening, and we can also get insights into the user that's causing these events. So if we want to track the number of these events that are happening over time, we can create a chart for that purpose, but we're going to need to add a filter here to look for the events with this particular name. So let's do that now. At the bottom we have the option of grouping here, and by default we're grouping by the level of the log output. I'm going to untick that, and we're going to tick the event name that we created a minute ago. So that gives us the ability to take all of the logs that are being sent to this source and group by the event's name. Once we've done that group by statement, we can perform a filter. So let's click this filters button, and we can filter on a particular field, and we have access to the event name here, and we can check if that's equal to a particular value. And the value I'm going to check for is sudo authentication failure. Now once we've done that, we can press enter, and that's going to add that filter to our query. And on the y-axis we're going to get a count of all of the events that are occurring, and in this case, because of our filter, it's going to be all of the events with the name of sudo authentication failure. Now what we can do on the right hand side is select a chart for this particular graph, and BetterStack has different chart types here. The one that we're going to use is a bar chart, so let's select that. And if we go down below here, we can see a preview of this chart, and we currently only have one of these, and that's the authentication failure that I just generated. Now what we can do is just save this chart, so let's go to the top and click the Save Chart button, and that's going to save the chart to the dashboard. So let's go back to the dashboard, and we're going to look at this particular dashboard, and we can see that we can drag and drop these particular charts around the template, around the canvas, and we can also expand the height and the width of the chart. One other thing we can do at the top here is expand the time range. By default that's going to be set to 3 hours. But if we want to see more events, for example the events I generated when preparing this video, we can expand that, and I'm going to select the last 12 hours. So now we can see a bar chart containing all of the events that have occurred, where the event name was equal to this sudo authentication failure that we can see here in the logs. And the usefulness of this chart is that it allows you to track when these events are occurring. And for example, if someone is trying to access the system as a super user, you're going to be able to see that represented in the dashboard, and that gives you that nice real-time analysis of the events that are happening on your Linux system. And of course we've set this up on the authentication log, but this kind of alerting and dashboarding can be done on any kind of file in the Linux system, and you can use Vector to facilitate that process of collecting those logs and shipping them to BetterStack. So that's all for this video. Before we finish, let's go back to the BetterStack guide that we have here. And what we can also do is we can set up alerting policies. And that would be a next step after visualizing the essential events and metrics through the charts and tables. You can also incorporate these alert mechanisms to ensure that you're promptly notified of any occurrences or deviations from the norm. And the BetterStack guide will walk you through the process of creating an alert on the platform. So that's all for this video. If you've enjoyed this content, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for much more in the future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.